Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. Can you hear me? Does it work? It works. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Georgieva, for your inspiring speech. There will be more time to ask questions and to react to this. But before that, I would like to welcome my two other panelists, Anne Street from Caritas UK and Mbuyiselo from Cape Town, who has come all the way to join us. Thank you so much. And you find their CVs in your folder, so I will not repeat all that. My name is Ulrike von Pilar. I am with Médecins Sans Frontières, based in Berlin. I'm the chair for this session, trying to keep the time, which is very urgent today because there are other meetings. There's also a term, Master of Ceremonies. We did try to find out yesterday what it means. I was expecting a flowing robe. Well, I did bring my bell, but actually in MSF, I think would call it just log admin, so it's a little less grand. Before we start the discussion, I have 2 minutes of housekeeping. So first thing is we try to be very good on timekeeping in the interest of everyone. I should also tell all of you that there is live streaming here in this hall. So if you have to say something absolutely confidential, which you might think about anyway in this big crowd, you have to rather do it in a group in the smaller room where there will be no live streaming. There are also 2 microphones for the hall, so later there will be a chance, at least for some of you, if not all of you, to come back to us with questions. And before I give the floor to Mbuyiselo, I just wanted to share 2 points with you. And coming here this morning, I was walking through this beautiful city and thinking how lucky I am to be safe and just walk on my own, which, as we know, is not always possible. And then I was wondering how many of us here in this room have actually suffered harassment, violence of all kinds. And do we talk about it? We don't usually. And so I think that's an indicator on how difficult the subject actually is we are trying to approach today. And maybe just as one example, which is very much on our heart at Médecins Sans Frontières, there are 2 young colleagues, 2 Spanish women, Mona and Bianca, who have been kidnapped more than 500 days ago in Dadaab. They're still held in the Somali area. And just, I thought, from a humanitarian congress, I would like to take your supportive thoughts for their families and for them, and hope that they will return very soon. Thank you very much. So now we turn to our panelists, and I would like Mbuyiselo to start and tell us about his experiences in his work in Cape Town.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Commissioner, and good morning, colleagues. As the chairperson will say, I'm from South Africa. I work for an organization called Sonke Gender Justice Network. Now, the name Sonke is a Guni word meaning all of us, Sonke. And I am in this country at a very appropriate moment in our history, in my country, in that we're facing an avalanche, a high rate of violence, of rape in South Africa. But having said that, I also come from a country that has an opportunity of working with men, something that is peculiar, something that is uncommon in most countries where the focus primarily becomes on working with men and boys. And then I'll talk to you, why do we work with men and boys to stop violence in South Africa? Because it is, and history has shown, and by the way, this has got nothing to do with Africa. Violence against women, and the Commissioner said, it's a universal phenomenon. But what makes violence in South Africa peculiar, it's also the history of that country. I come from a country not many years ago that made violence that made violence a norm. When you look at apartheid, what it did to the majority of citizens in that country, it used violence as a weapon to oppress, to subjugate its majority citizens. So there is a context, there's an explanation of why should we work with men in the world, and in South Africa in particular, because if we don't, we're losing the people who are perpetrators, the people who are raised in a particular manner. And this is what I want to talk about. You see, colleagues, this morning, unless all of us, and I'm excited that we have men in this room, unless all of us as men in this room, and I'm saying throughout the world, unless we begin to challenge patriarchy, unless we begin to challenge the privilege of our mainness. You see, the oppression of women, it's not accidental. It has its genesis, it has its roots as to how, and I want to emphasize, how all of us in this room were raised. Unless we begin to say, but these privileges, but these benefits of our mainness, there's something toxic about them. Unless we begin to say that, all of us, we will not do anything about violence. Unless we begin to acknowledge and say there's something fundamentally wrong about patriarchy and its ugly, toxic, attendant consequences. And they are the power we wield, the privilege we have, but also how as men we always look the other way. And we are here today, 8th of March. We are part of a global village that today talks about ringing the bell, where all of us should be midday in South Africa, where I come from. We will be joining the world in ringing the bell and say that, not in my name. As men in South Africa, we are in a project that calls the One Man Can, Not in My Name, that the violence we see should not be perpetrated by men using our name as men. You would know Oscar Pistorius, South Africa, River Steenkamp killed. Young, aspirant, beautiful, clever, achieving young girl killed. And I'm not going to pronounce on the guilt or the merit or the lack of the case, but to say it is in fact a symptomatic of how all of us as men were raised to believe that violence is in fact an answer to our situations. That as men in this room, in the world, that we will always use our domination, violence, as an instrument of power. But having said that, what Sonke does, we have a program that's called the One Man Can. And this program of working with boys and girls has results that clearly shows evidence, which is scientific, that indeed, when you work with boys and men, there is change. And some of you could argue that 20 years in our democracy in South Africa, why is it that you still have this violent nature of violence itself? And I would want to say that it's because of the not so much a glorious history of our country based on the past regime or based on apartheid. But we as Sonke felt that we need to invest in working with boys and men. And for many reasons, but for one reason, which is more important, is that when you invest in men, you are sure that you are investing in the future generations. You are investing in the boys that tomorrow will emerge and say that I will not be defined by violence. I will not be defined by what it means to be a man. And that is why I hope that as we deliberate this morning, this afternoon, I hope that we would be able to ask ourselves, especially men that are here, what is it that I can do in my community? What is it that I can do in my family, in my own house? I mean, I speak with you. I'm raising 3 children, 2 boys and 2 girls and 1 boy. And part of this doing this work is in fact selfish, in that I want my 33-year-old boy to be different and to speak a language that says, not in my name. But I also want my 2 girls, one 23 and one 18, to grow up in an environment where she would not always have to look above to look at her bag. Meaning, therefore, that there is something in it for me. And we must find and ask the question this morning that all of us men, we must find it in ourselves, in our own spaces, to say that I have a duty to stand up. I have a duty not to look the other way, but I also have a duty not to fold arms. And I have a duty to say that violence will not happen in my name. And the One Man Can program, it's a program that says, let's challenge each other. Let's engage each other. Let's ask the difficult, uncomfortable questions that ordinarily as men we never ask. Let's ask ourselves as men, what is my role when the whole world is faced with such atrocious violence? What is it that I can do? I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mbuyiselo. I think there will be many questions on how to actually do it. So I think there will be. We will get back to you later. Thank you. And please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure. And I've been particularly inspired to hear the talk of our Humanitarian Commissioner and the important leadership she brings to this subject. And thank you also to our previous speaker. We need men like you. The Commissioner referred to the situation in the Congo, and back in 2008, Major General Patrick Comart, who was one of the commanders in the United Nations peacekeeping mission in the Congo, made the horrifying observation: it's now more dangerous to be a woman than a soldier in modern conflict. This was a stunning admission and galvanized many of us into recognizing that the continued failure of the humanitarian community to effectively protect women in conflict situations. I think we have made huge strides in the right direction, but there still continues to be a big chasm between the policy rhetoric and our practices in meeting women's needs in conflict and rapid onset emergencies. And in my remarks, I want to chart this path that we've made in addressing women's needs and examine how far we've come, and end by giving a few reflections on where we need to go in the future. 16 years ago, in 1997, the United Nations ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, agreed a definition of gender mainstreaming that incorporated the need for programs and policies to assess the implications for women and men in all areas and levels, and to ensure that their differing experiences and concerns are integral to the design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation in all spheres, so that men and women can benefit equally and inequality is not perpetuated. So how far have we come to achieve this in the intervening years? I think, sadly, that the evidence is that despite much money and many resources, we still have a long way to go in the humanitarian sector. So why is this the case? I think partly the answer is that actually we don't know how well we are doing, because the reality is that sex and age disaggregated data is, although it's increasingly being collected by agencies, we still haven't taken the necessary next step, which is to use it to really inform our program decisions and for that information to lead to appropriate action. Recent research shows that often when sex and age disaggregated data is collected, our program teams on the ground don't know what to do with it and how to use it. It's often not accompanied by a gender analysis, particularly in the first and second phases of a rapid onset emergency, the first 5 or 6 weeks, when it really isn't a priority for many humanitarian responders. Clear examples of this came out of the experiences of the tsunami, when up to 4 times as many women as men were killed. But the implications of this were not initially addressed sufficiently in humanitarian response. And it was only when programmers began to ask, what does this data tell us? And to start applying a gender analysis and looking at the reasons behind the data, that they could devise appropriate interventions to meet both men's and women's needs. So, for example, one of the outcomes of so many women dying was that there were many men left alone to care for children. And they sought young girls to marry, to look after their children. And so there was a huge escalation of early marriage. Initially, this was missed, and it was only later that interventions were introduced to address childcare needs and educate communities on the danger of early marriage for young girls. In another example, when programmers interrogated the data, they realized that most women couldn't swim, and that men were not were not present in public spaces, and the Commissioner referred to this in Pakistan after the floods. And so the messages that we need to bring to men and women are different about safety and about how they protect themselves and how they survive. So we as humanitarian responders and policy analysts should routinely ask the crucial question, what does the data tell us about different needs? And how are we using that data to guide and inform our approaches to interventions so that we can adequately address need? So why are we really falling behind in this area? And I think that the international community has put in huge resources, and I'm sure that everyone in this room has been involved in that. There have been gender guidelines produced by the United Nations Interagency Standing Committee. Many of our own agencies have gender advisors who work in humanitarian situations. And in 2007, the UN set up the Gender Standby Roster, which has been a huge success, known as GenCap. And in the intervening years, they've provided gender advisors to 30 emergency situations. And they've supported the humanitarian country teams to really push through gender analysis and looking at needs assessments. And we also have the gender marker. But despite all these efforts, still we're not allocating the resources. And for example, with the multi-donor trust funds, less than 5% of money of those funds for post-conflict situations is dedicated to supporting women's empowerment. In Haiti, after the earthquake, of the 1.4 billion requested for humanitarian response in 2010, only 5 million, that's less than 1%, was earmarked for addressing violence against women and girls, despite widespread rapes and sexual attacks on women and girls living in the displaced camps. Finally, encouragingly enough, the United Nations Secretary General has called on UN agencies to allocate a minimum of 15% of their budgets to be spent on gender equality and women's empowerment in post-conflict peace building. But we're not there yet, and that amount of money is not dedicated to these issues. So finally, I want to end by just reflecting a little bit on where I think we need to place the emphasis going forward within our own agencies and in the humanitarian community at large. And I think a lot of these steps are being addressed, but they're worth reiterating. I think one of the most important things is leadership. We need to focus humanitarian leaders within our own organizations and across the sector to ensure that they have a greater understanding of gender gaps in humanitarian response, and to support them to ensure that they fulfill their responsibilities for gender equality programming. Secondly, in accountability, I think we need to ensure that gender dimensions are mainstreamed into emerging accountability frameworks for performance, and that we work on this within our own organisations. Thirdly, I think that the new resilience agenda offers us really exciting opportunities to place women at the heart of evolving approaches, and particularly in emergency response, where we know that women often at the community level are active leaders. But I think that we need to take this one step higher, because often at the higher levels, men still dominate. And one example of this is many governments now have increasingly effective national disaster management authorities. But I think we need to focus on working with them to support them to engage with women's networks so that they can support their own women to play a more active role. Finally, I think that donors have a huge role to play in this. I think that there has been already quite a lot done through the good humanitarian donorship to mainstream gender. But I think we have to move beyond a tick box approach to requesting real evidence. And in this regard, I think it's worth noting the leadership of the Swedish government, who recently announced that they would judge project funding applications against the IASC gender marker and would not fund any projects which have a 0 rating. And I know that ECHO is also presently considering drawing up its own gender marker. So I think these are very encouraging steps. And finally, I think we all need to do a better job of raising awareness within our own stakeholders on how gender equality programming, including the systematic collection of data and its analysis, can actually contribute to improved humanitarian outcomes for the people that we serve.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne, for your proposals. And I actually hand over to Madam Georgieva. You have been addressed. Georgieva, sorry, I put in an N which isn't belonging there, sorry.
It would have if I was Russian.
Oh, I see the problem. Yes, I wasn't aware of that. So there have been questions also addressed directly to you, and I would like, in addition, to pick up on something Anne said at the beginning of her presentation, that she said she observes a failure of the humanitarian community to protect women from violence. And I think that is actually going a bit to the heart of the matter also of this day, but a difficult question. What do you think actually? Who is that humanitarian community who would have that obligation to really devise measures to protect women from violence? Can we actually deliver on that?
There is a very big role for the humanitarian community that we currently perform. In many cases, just the very presence of humanitarian workers is protection for everybody, for men and women. But we also, as community, must recognize that there is more we can do in 3 aspects. One, to play a much stronger advocacy role to others who are critical for success in protection of women, in particular the military, UN peacekeepers, EU missions, the national military. There is a huge amount of work that must be done to raise awareness, training, and also not tolerance for impunity when army people themselves rape women. And that job, I think we are now recognizing as community as more important, and we are doing more of it. And I can tell you in my own interactions with EU military staff, we advocate very strongly that EU military missions must have a gender advisors, officers whose job is to make sure that behavior is right, but also that we engage in training others. Right now we have a training mission in Mali, and this is now integrated in this training mission. And of course, we Europeans within the United Nations decisions on peacekeeping missions, hugely important that we hold this topic high and we do not waver on the issue of impunity. Secondly, as a humanitarian community, we have to look beyond our operations into the moral persuasion we undertake to be part in changing the mindset of men and also lifting up responsibility of women in leadership on this issue. Yesterday I was in Brussels listening to President Peres of Israel, who spoke about a very interesting talk, but among other things he said how very important it is to address the men of the Middle East is to unleash the potential of women so the Middle East can be more prosperous and more peaceful. I think we have to be more actively engaged in this big conversation of changing mindsets of men and also responsibility of women. And I would tell you this very personal anecdote on the issue of mindset change. My husband is a wonderful man. He's the most gentle, respectful man I know. This is why I married him. We are in the United States. I lived there for many years. I'm driving, he's sitting next to me and looking left, looking right. And at one point he said, really bored. And at one point he says, oh, very interesting. I have been counting drivers and you know, half of the drivers are women. As a big surprise. I said, yeah, half of the people, actually a little more than half of the people on this planet are women. But that was a huge wake-up call for me that there is this roles assigned to men and women, and that we have a long way to go to change mindsets if we want to win on this, or if we want to mobilize energy. And then my last point is on our responsibility as women. We must speak up for the women who cannot speak up for themselves. We must be out there. We must be out there on any opportunity, on any occasion, to speak against violence against women, to speak against the discrimination of women, the fact that women in many societies cannot contribute to the well-being of their own people because they are left out. And I think that very often we women tend to shy away from this responsibility because we say, oh, that's old-fashioned feminism. No, it is not. Because for these millions of women who are far from having access to deploying their skills and brain and capabilities, who are under threat of violence, they look up to people like Hillary Clinton and Cathy Ashton, and you know, in a small way, to me, to be out there and make this case. May I? Do I have 1 second? Just to finish again. We were talking about this on the way here. I remember I was at the World Bank, and the president of the World Bank called me to go to Moscow as a country director for Russia. And everybody who knew me came to my office and said, "You're nuts to go to Russia. Russia is macho, chauvinist, you know, no place for women." So I said, "Well, yeah, okay." I shied away for a while, and then I said, "No, I owe it to the Russian women to go to Russia." And sure, that was the right thing to do. So I'm in Russia, and I go to my first diplomatic reception. 250 senior diplomats, including the ambassadors of the EU member states. How many women were there? 3. You're close, but not close enough. She said 3. 2. two women, the cultural attaché of the Brazilian embassy and me. My point is that we men and women, we have a big job to do. And for the humanitarian community, it is not just an operational job, it is also hugely important advocacy job.
Thank you. Mbuyiselo, you wanted to react to this directly?
Well, I fully agree
Please.
with what you
You
say.
agree?
I think also, I think what we have not done throughout the world is to invest in the early childhood education. I think we are where we are. And I like the emphasis, colleagues, to say that this is a universal problem. Because you see, the thinking more often than not is that it's them. It happens to certain communities. But I want to emphasize and say that unless we all invest in the early childhood education, imagine what would happen if our crutches, if you know that your daughter, your son is at crèche, and she is having an education that specifically talks about equality at that young age. But imagine what would happen where we don't wait and close the stable when the horse has bolted, where you really focus on early childhood education, where young boys, young girls grow up understanding that these things are normal. I mean, where I come from in South Africa, there has been instances where you tend to think that violence is normal. And the work we do is to say, how do we reverse that process? How do we change, Commissioner, the mindset you spoke about? We can only change that when we actively engage, challenge men.
Yep. Well, evidently agreeing is not enough. So the question is exactly what can be done. Maybe also someone here in the hall disagrees with something that was said. So actually, I would like to open the floor to your questions, comments, remarks, provided they are very short. And I think there are now 2 microphones. Can we see them? Yes. And I would like to ask you, when you ask a question, to very briefly introduce yourself. And if you can, try to address your question to a specific person here in the panel. It helps. So, who would like to make a start? Please. Here.
Hello, my name is Julia Socha, and I'm working with the International Fellowship of Reconciliation here in Austria. And my question is addressed to Ms. Street, because you mentioned the idea of action based on gender analysis and policy based on gender analysis, and I was wondering if there's any conflict analysis that these policies are based on, because so many times humanitarian assistance and humanitarian aid, if it doesn't take into consideration the broader context, especially in conflict-affected areas, it can turn into something that exaggerates, escalates the situation. And I was wondering if the other speakers as well would like to answer this question, if this is done as well.
Thank you. Please, just go ahead.
Well, we are doing work. I think it was actually for you. The question,
sorry.
But I don't mind. I don't mind to add, but I think the question was first. Please, you start. Yes.
No, thank you. I think it is a big challenge, particularly in rapid onset emergency, and certainly from the evidence of a couple of studies that have come out in the last 2 or 3 years, looking at how we're doing within the humanitarian sector on this, there does seem to be a real disjuncture between the collection of data and how you analyze that. You know, and it's understandable in these very fast-moving situations. But I think what we need to get better at doing is both gender analysis and vulnerability analysis. So, for example, looking at your data and saying, well, from that, actually, who are the most vulnerable groups? And certainly, within my own organization, I think we struggle with this. And when we did a review of our work for the Pakistan earthquake back in 2005, we found that the disaggregated data that looked at what were the different needs for men and women was actually being collected after the programs had already started. So now we're trying to move towards actually meshing that data more at the beginning, but it is very hard. So I think it remains very much a work in progress, and I'd be really interested to hear the experiences of other organizations in this room.
Well, I'm sorry I started answering this question, but the reason I did that is because we, in this new gender policy, that gender mainstreaming policy we are now about to introduce, we are putting a very strong emphasis on demanding sex and age disaggregated data and analysis to accompany it in project proposals. Recognizing two things, though. One, that in emergencies, sometimes time is so precious that we want to move action very quickly. Therefore, we have to have some way of adjusting proposals or collecting information and adjusting proposals. And to be honest, we donors, including the European Commission, we have to introduce more agility, more flexibility in the way we engage with our partners, and that this is something we struggle with. We look into this. And secondly, that we are not yet at the point, and we need to get there, and you actually ask us a question, where are you failing? And this is one area we are still failing. To be able to map out emergencies and areas of risk, and then consciously identify where this is absolutely crucial, because not all disasters are born equal. Not all crises are born equal. And that is the work that we only can do collectively as community. And I think it is very encouraging that this work is now moving, finally moving quite in a structured, in a systematic way. So I'm an optimist, I'm born optimist, but I'm actually more encouraged now than I would have been when I started 3 years ago, that gender mainstreaming is going to turn into a very practical, contributing to this mindset change and operational improvement, rather than a box to tick so your proposal goes through.
Hello, my name is Lala. I'm a medical doctor. I just wondered, my question addresses our European Commissioner. I very much agree about the approach to start also from the national militaries. I just wonder, there was an NGO specialized in gender-based violence that addressed the German military and asked to do a training module about this subject, and it was refused, with also the comment not to speak up about the problems that have been happening amongst the UN troops, because this would make the wives of the German soldiers feel insecure. Do you have any comment on that?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite, I apologize, I didn't quite understand. The question is, would you? I apologize. Yeah. I'm not quite clear. I got the question.
So there's an NGO specialized in gender-based violence, and they approached the German military to do a training module amongst the soldiers that are going on international missions.
Yes.
And this was refused. And there was also a comment out of the military saying that the NGO would be better off not to openly speak about the problems that have happening amongst the international troops, where international troops have been perpetrators of sexual violence too, not only the local military.
I'm not familiar with this particular case. I cannot comment on whether the NGO you are referring to had the objectively the competencies and putting itself forward was the appropriate or not appropriate case. So I will follow up on that. But on the second part of your question, whether we should be ducking and sitting tight and being quiet, absolutely not. We have a responsibility to lead by example. And that is a responsibility majority of the military in Europe actually recognizes. I have only good things to say about EU military staff. They do take the responsibility of EU missions and EU training, including EU training missions, very seriously. Again, I'm not familiar with the case, but on the face value of what you're telling me, it is not appropriate to put under the carpet wrongdoing of anyone, including of our own, and even more so of our own troops, because we would never change the chances of women in conflicts if we allow impunity for anyone. That I could not say it in a stronger way. Of course, for this we all need to actually have a very good impression overall of EU defense leadership, of the EU defense ministers. I meet with them, not very frequently, but I do meet with them. And they are very all the responsibility we have to protect neutrality, impartiality, and independence of humanitarian workers, and for military to be a force for good in conflict situations. But then that leadership, of course, needs to translate into operational response down the chain of command. And I have somebody from my team here sitting on the front row. She can exchange, coordinate with you, and then we can follow up on the specifics of the case, so I can comment.
Yes, here, please.
Good morning, my name's Jane Welsh, I'm from Australia, and I just have a question for Kristalina about, in your presentation you were talking about vouchers for women and empowering women economically. My concern and also my question is, DFID has released a statement about how economic empowerment of women is not the magic bullet and often does cause a spike in gender-based violence, particularly domestic violence, when women receive microcredit, when women receive cash vouchers, when women are only focused for economic empowerment. So my question is, how are you addressing the spike in violence when women are only kind of focused in development efforts through, microcredit, cash transfers and whatnot? Is there strategies and policies in place to prevent any fallout from that?
This is a very good point, and yes, indeed, when there is a shift towards empowering women that has a downside of disempowering men, that can lead to trouble for women as well. And I agree with your point. I mean, when I was speaking, I didn't have the time to get into all the caveats of the story. But there are two very important considerations, and we try to put them in place. One is do it when it is appropriate. For example, in Niger, the example I gave, there is overall acceptance that it is appropriate in communities to give more to women at the moment of severe hardship. There are places where this may not work so well, and I'm thinking of, say, Pakistan, where there could be culturally much bigger impediment to empowering women, and we have to do it carefully. But frankly, the second part is much more important, and it is empowering everyone. Development has to be for everyone. It should not be development for women, forget about the men. And this is where, as humanitarian community, we have a great opportunity to build bridges with our development colleagues. Very often, we are on the front line. We have eyes and ears on the ground, we work with local communities. But the scale of our operations is small. And if we target women, we distarget men. But if we work together with our development colleagues, and in this particular case, we actually do exactly that. We also have a food security program that goes for agricultural development in this area, beyond the emergency caused by the drought. And there, of course, beneficiaries are both men and women. But it is, I mean, I'm very much with you that sometimes the road to hell is paved with good intentions, that we have to be very sensitive to the unintended consequences of operations and policies we promote. Unfortunately, what is the key to not get it wrong? I mean, the key is common sense. But we all know in this room that the most common thing about common sense, not very common. So we have a problem. What is the solution? I mean, problem clear. The solution is what actually we were talking here about, to relentlessly experiment, learn, apply, scale up, correct, relentlessly. And that is, in a sense, we are in the world of lifelong learning. That applies to us in humanitarian action and development as well. And if you're wrong, don't shy to say it and change what you do. But very good point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bera Squin from World Vision. I have a particular interest in the effectiveness of interagency processes, looking at the IASC, the clusters where UN and non-government organizations meet. In the context of the potential for joint assessments to be more inclusive, my question is actually directed to Anne and also to the gentleman from South Africa. Are non-government organizations themselves ready? Do we in our own organizations have an adequate voice on these issues? And speaking to the international NGOs who are represented, are we sufficiently reflecting our southern partners so that the voice for women and to prevent gender-based violence is actually more authentic from our side and better represented in the potential for joint assessments that actually do discuss these issues? Thank you.
Thank you. Anne, you start, then you come.
Is my microphone right? Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yes, I think that this does remain quite a challenge for us. And I think in the interagency processes, one of the challenges is that actually they're still quite northern dominated. So it's much harder for the voices of our partners, of national NGOs, to be represented and to bring their experiences into those fora. And I think that we need to work hard, particularly at the country level, in opening up those processes through the clusters and other mechanisms to really involving national NGOs. I mean, I think we are seeing progress in this area, and more national NGOs are starting to participate in the clusters and even taking up co-leadership roles in some of the clusters. But I think that this is quite a challenge. I think in some of the gender processes, national NGOs are very involved. So, for example, the interagency sub-working group on gender, the NGOs are playing a leadership role in that. And at the moment, the gender handbook is being revised, and I think the consultation has gone out very widely. And hopefully, national and international NGOs can actually share that and reach their own partner organisations to get their input. But I think it's very much a work in progress.
Yeah, I don't think it's easy, but I think it's beginning to happen where this collaboration or the working or raising the voices, especially of the national NGOs, is beginning to happen. But what I don't find happening, I mean, we are talking today, a week or it's still continuing, CSW, there's meetings in New York specifically about, gender-based violence. And the topic of discussion this month, the CSW, is, stopping gender-based violence, but engaging men more proactively. I think what is lacking for me is where NGOs nationally be able or be capacitated of hearing and not imposing what are the issues on the ground, so that when we work with the UN agencies, then the voices that are prominent are in fact the voices of those that are historically voiceless. That's still lacking, but we need to work on it, all of us. But I must also hasten to add that I have found a level of wanting to hear from the UN agencies and not imposing solutions or strategies.
Okay, I can take one last question. If there are 2, 3. Now you're a little late to wake up. I think I would like the lady in the 4th row here, and apologies to the others. There's still a chance, at least to discuss with Anne and Mbuyiselo the whole day.
My name is Irene Ochawapoda. I'm working for the Vienna International for Development and Cooperation in Vienna here. My question is for Mr. Botha. Why is it so difficult in the world and in Africa for men to know that women are important, since we know that every man has a mother? Why is it so complicated that we have to make Congress and policies to put this person in its place? Secondly, I would like to know what is done in Africa for this gender matter, because we know that officially it is important, but actually what is done? And third question, in the humanitarian action, women are very, very active, but not visible. What can we do in Africa? Thank you.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to ask. Thank you so much, Sisi. Quite difficult, and I try to steer away from. Is there something that's peculiar about Africa vis-a-vis violence against women? My ideology is biased to say that this is a universal phenomenon. It may be more accentuated, more pronounced in Africa for various reasons, and mainly issues of poverty, issues of, in some instances, illiteracy. But if you say to me this morning, why is it that in Africa we are not able to be seen to be arresting the issues of respect for women? I want to argue this morning and say that, and this is what I said in my talk, unless we do programmatic work that is 365 days, that really focuses on how do you bring up the child? How do I bring up the boy that I have? How do you also bring up the girl that you have? But having said, this is more at home, but very critical. How do you, when you have other institutions, I mean, how do you ensure that as you do this work at home, it also moves on to the AU? But doesn't only move on to the AU, it also moves on to other institutions. I mean, I still have to hear how political leaders talk about women. And one thing that South Africa has done, and successfully so, is, I mean, after Rwanda, which is leading in Africa in terms of women representative in parliamentarians or politicians, Rwanda would be the first. And South Africa, I think, would be either third or second, is where you, at a very symbolic level, where you really ensure that women's leadership are a focus, are in the spotlight. And not because it's something that you think it's symbolic, but something that is important must be done. And I mean, when you look at the parliamentarians, when you live public representatives in South Africa, I mean, and where you find ministries, and this is what the commissioner was talking about, where ministries that are important, I mean, your finance, your energy, I mean, your critical ministries, where you find a woman leading or having a leading role. By that, I mean, you don't have one, someone used this word, I don't like bullets, but I'll use it. You don't have one magic bullet. But where you really say all of these institutions, where we contribute, you have institutions like the leadership politically that creatively ensure that women's roles are not, I mean, you don't have women as just HR, but you have women in critical. So this, I mean, you start at home, but you then move on to other institutions at home that are critical. You would find that it's going to go a long way, but where women, I mean, where you'd find women's voices are extremely critical. So when we do all of those efforts, it's going to, and maybe not in my lifetime. I mean, when you are above 50 and dealing with this, it may not happen in my lifetime, but it's important to say that these are the strategies that you have. I mean, I wonder, I don't know, the Austrian university and others. So imagine what would happen if at all universities throughout the world, women's leadership is not only symbolic, but it is strategic, it's important. So you need a combination of factors. It's not a be-all and end-all, or a size-fits-all answer. You ask a very difficult question. I mean, I sit here, it would be very important one day that you have the Pope who's a woman. Imagine what would that do to my girl child. As the enclave they're meeting, imagine what would happen when the white smoke comes up and there's Maria, who's the first Pope, you know, in the whole world. I mean, imagine what that would do. I mean, what sort of message it would send to my two daughters, that, you know, it's possible. And we've been able to achieve that in my country, in that, despite all the violence, where you'd have the first deputy president being a woman in South Africa, in Africa. So you'd need a combination of many strategies. There is no, as I said, one size fits all. And it can't be easy. I mean, the men that are sitting here, all of us, it can't be easy to lose power. There's nothing as wonderful, as enterprising as power. I mean, imagine men that are here, if you close us in an enclave, fortunately not maybe for the Pope position, where we talk about, is it easy to lose power? It can't be, because there are benefits that come with being powerful. We've been privileged as men. And none of us here would deny the fact that we love being beneficiaries of power.
Yes. Exactly. Thank you.
I must stop. You know, my daughters are not here, but they keep on asking, telling me that I go on and on and on and on. So I'm afraid some of you may know them and phone them, and he's starting again. He's going on and on and on. So I must stop now. And respect the commissioner.
We'd love to listen to you. Two last remarks.
It is a very interesting idea to put among the in the categories of gender markers for advancing in gender equality, a woman becoming a pope. We can put it right there.
That would be nice.
But change is such an interesting thing. It is much more arts than science. I grew up on the other side of the Iron Curtain in Bulgaria. For many years in my life, if anybody was to tell me, you will be a European commissioner in the European Union, I would have said, come on, you're kidding me. But it happened. And it happened because, in a sense, what you were saying, enough people said enough is enough. And it is a matter of all of us, to brave to say enough is enough. And equality means equality. It doesn't mean 30% women in the leadership of the Commission. It means probably 50-50, yeah? And that day, I'm absolutely convinced it will come in our generation. I wanted to disagree with you. We will see. And the reason it is to come in our generation is because if our world is to succeed, it has to rid itself from extreme injustice. It has to. So, enough is enough.
Thank you. And one last word.
I agree with you.
Well, they do say that to work in this sector, you have to be an optimist. And I always say I am an optimist, but I have to say yesterday on the Underground in London, coming to get the plane, I read of a report that showed that young women graduates coming out of into their first jobs in England are consistently getting lower salaries than men in every sector excepting two, and you just wring your head. So I think the challenges are all around. But I think we also have to challenge our own assumptions as humanitarians and as operators. And I just wanted to end with a very short story really about Haiti and about the after the earthquake when the cholera hit. Now, cholera is usually assumed to be a gender-neutral illness, and I'm sure that the health people here can say more about that, but it's generally assumed to affect men and women pretty much equally, and there aren't necessarily huge gender dimensions. Looking a little bit beyond that, organisations then said, well, actually women are the primary food providers, primary carers, so let's target our health messages, our hygiene messages to women. So some of the agencies in Haiti started doing this in 2011. And then when they looked at the data, they actually found that 67% of the deaths were men, not women. So they then had to go back to their programs and say, well, we're primarily targeting women. Is that appropriate, and what do we need to do? So I think all the time we have to be vigilant and work on these issues.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you. Someone mentioned that we all should be, in one way or the other, role model. Now, looking at humanitarian organizations, I'm not convinced we have really done our job. ICRC, MSF, Caritas, I don't think they're exactly crowded by women on the leading positions. So maybe we should be optimistic about that too. Thanks for taking so much time. Thanks to my panelists. You have a coffee break, and we'll meet all together again at 11 o'clock. Thank you very much.